Don't imagine I've been selected to go to Perelandra because I'm anyone in particular. One can never see, or not till long afterwards, why anyone was selected for any job. And when one does, it is usually some reason that leaves no room for vanity.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 3, Perelandra Chapter 2, Ransom Returns. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack, your favorite weekly C.S. Lewis podcast, run by three Thacandrians, Andrew, David, and myself. This season, we're once again following the adventures of Elwyn Ransom, who this time is exploring Perelandra. And today we're diving into Chapter 2. Before we dive in, it is officially the shot clock countdown timer to the wedding, 30 days in counting. Any homestretch advice for me?
Yeah, fewer sports metaphors. Shot clock.
Well, hopefully most things are done now. So I would just say relax, enjoy exclusive use of your bed, no clumps of hair pushed onto the windows of the shower or the tiles of the shower. Closet space. Make the most of it right now because all that's going away.
Kristen and I call them hair spiders.
I call them Wookiees.
Oh, Wookiees. Okay.
Because I see them and I go,
oh, that's great. Matt, like I was telling you before we started recording, but it may be a good thing to appoint a logistics person, especially in the day or two before the wedding, someone you can hand your phone to, because people will be emailing you, texting you, calling you. Hey, what do I wear? Hey, what time is this? Hey, where is that? And they are going to lose their minds and not understand that your entire 2 or 3 days beforehand are entirely accounted for. And so also, and we'll touch on this maybe later on in the chapter, Lewis says parting is neither good mirth nor good sorrow. And part of what he means is the moment of the huge event is not the really good time to say the thing that needs getting said. So as people come in, have those conversations kind of over coffee or while you're washing up the dishes and say those things that are in your heart. Have those moments, seek those out. Finally, what I'd say is this is about a marriage, and the wedding is just the first step in that. And so while the wedding seems paramount of importance, it will continue to grow less and less important as the marriage goes on. It's hugely important, and I can't wait to be there. We can't wait to come and bear witness. But the marriage is just the inception, or the wedding is just the inception of the real thing, which is the marriage.
I got to say, David, you might remember this. We have had one of the most blessed pre-Canas, and it's focused very singularly on Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and then now we've deviated from that. But obviously the pinnacle of Genesis 2, before the fall, was man and woman coming together. And so the union, in the marital union, was the pinnacle of the creation story. And then the first thing Satan comes and attacks is that union. And so that's a sacrament that predates the fall. And what was so beautiful was our priest pointed out, because I remember making a comment. I was like, man, to some degree, it's a little bit scary. You have this pinnacle of this thing, and then you know that Satan is going to do everything in his power to attack it. And the priest mentioned to me somewhere, and this is where I'm hoping you can pick up the pieces, that there's only 2 times this word and this language is used in the entire scripture, like the eyes were opened or something like that. And one of them is in there. I don't know if it was when like God came and they were ashamed and then
after they ate the fruit.
There we go. And then the other time, okay, yes. And they took it. They took that. But the irony of the entire story was the other time it was ever used was the road to Emmaus, the first Eucharistic service with the disciples. Their eyes were opened.
And they recognized him in the breaking of bread.
Yes. And we were going to receive that anyways through the Eucharistic, the Mass, the sacrifice. But we decided to take what was going to be given to us. It was just one of the more profound things. And he also just discussed the importance of the Eucharist in connection with the sacrament of marriage. And I was just like, whoa.
There's a connection between revelation and eating, right? Because he's known to them in the breaking of bread, right? So that moment on Emmaus is Eucharistic. They took and ate wrongly and were blinded. I mean, their eyes were open, but they didn't see themselves from God's perspective. They saw themselves from their own perspective, and they were naked and ashamed. And God intended them, like we see Ransom later today, naked and unashamed. And so the right eating, and then when you put in the 4 loves about lovers wanting to consume each other, there is something, the consummation of marriage is a consuming. It has echoes of the Eucharist.
Yes.
And what's the ultimate of the end? What's the next and final Eucharistic feast? It's the marriage supper of the Lamb, right? And that's when all of the world will be unified and salvation will come. And again, that is a feast that is a fulfillment. And so what you have in the wedding is the feast, especially in the days, the night of and the days after, you have a consummation and a feast, but it goes on to be an ongoing thing that continues to feed you.
Personally, if I was connecting the Eucharist and marriage, I would have said that the loving and the consuming are the same, Andrew. But, you use whatever examples you prefer.
Well, hang on.
I will say I want to bring my pre-Cana priest on because I just don't feel like this is talked about enough. Like, I can't believe I just went through my entire life, shame on my Catholic formation growing up, that this concept wasn't made more evident on a more just yearly basis. I mean, it's just so incredibly beautiful. So anyways, I wanted to do a little tangent here because I just thought maybe our listeners might enjoy that before we dive into this. And we are kind of talking about the pre-fall, so there is sort of a connection here. So, just saying.
Well, you can have a post-Cana episode on Pints with Jack. I think that's a good idea.
I love it. All right. So, gentlemen, before we dive in, what drinks are we drinking?
Well, I'm drinking coffee again, but I have decided I love these Starbucks global icons. I like a big cup of coffee. 10 ounces is not enough because I put milk in mine. And so I have 2 from China and 3 from England. But I thought, you know what? Let me start looking around on eBay. And if I can find them for under $20, including shipping, I'm going to try to get all of the places that I have spent time with or lived at. And so I've got Houston and Chicago. So it's San Antonio blend from the Chicago Cup.
I love it.
Well, I'm drinking a Best Day Brewing Kolsch, but also a cup of tea from my official member of the C.S. Lewis Saroni Club.
Oh, man.
Which I got for going on That Hideous C.S. Lewis podcast.
Please, I want an invite to that. Who do I need to talk to? I don't want to go.
I'll hook you up with Brian.
Thank you very much.
Wouldn't it be incredible if there became a proliferation of C.S. Lewis podcasts and he just...
With mugs.
With mugs. And he just took center stage in this next generation from a theological perspective. I think that would be so beautiful. I would love that.
Or at the very least, a mug perspective.
Ooh,
oh, wow.
Funny.
There we go.
Anyways, I am just drinking my Celsius. It's delicious. So today we're going to be toasting Patreon supporter Louise Brown.
That's probably Louise.
Louise Brown. And as we enter into this chapter, we just raise a glass to you, and we would just pray that as you embark on any journey that God calls you to where there is unknown, that you may surrender with just a passionless obedience and a desire to live out his will. Cheers.
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 And before we dive into the chapter summary, as I mentioned, just for the next couple episodes, a reminder, if you guys feel called to support us on Patreon, that is incredibly helpful as we continue to grow this ministry and this podcast. You can just go into Google, Patreon, Pints with Jack. But if you can't, that is totally fine. Another way that is insanely helpful, free, and only takes 10 seconds is to press pause and click 5 stars. The reviews, we're trying to get to 750 to 1,000 reviews. Those are really helpful for getting guests and upping our game and attracting more individuals. So we would love if you could do that. Now back to our show and David in the chapter summary.
Yes, here is my 100-word summary of chapter 2. Ransom tells Lewis he's not surprised that he experienced opposition on his way to the cottage, as the enemy knows that something is brewing. Ransom is to be sent to Perelandra. There, alone, he must defend it. He knows few details, but suspects he's been chosen because he knows the universal language of Old Solar. A naked Ransom climbs blindfolded into the coffin and is swept up into the sky by the Oyasa. And over a year later, Lewis returns with Dr. Humphrey to unpack Ransom from the coffin. Over tea, Ransom begins to tell the story of his adventure.
That's it. We know the ending. Season's over. Shortest season in Pints with Jack history. He returns.
Well, we begin this chapter with Ransom entering the cottage, lighting a candle, and the two men, Ransom and Lewis, we're going to find out that he's Lewis in this chapter, they're seemingly alone. And Lewis identifies what he tripped over earlier. We mentioned it in the previous episode. It's a coffin-shaped casket and lid made out of some kind of white material. It's often described as ice, but it's not ice. It's something a little different. Before we get deep into this chapter, any opening comments?
Well, he begins by turning the light on. And although it's simply what he's doing, he's lighting a candle, and that's what Lewis would have done. And I don't want to over-analogize everything. This idea of perspective, he has been in the growing dark, and he finally gets into the place where he belongs, and he turns on the lights, and that helps everything. And this is just part of Lewis's commitment to clarity and to making things clear.
I will say, too, this is more a commentary, not on the specific part, but on the chapter itself. I've read Perelandra before, but I just forgot how much this one is even so far. The underpinnings are even stronger towards the spiritual journey, the metaphors, and the things that we can take away in terms of what Lewis is communicating. We can expect a spiritual journey to be like, how we're supposed to respond, the type of spiritual battle going on. There's just so much in here, and we see it all coming in this chapter, or at least a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the only thing that I wanted to say about this little bit, the opening portion, is that Jupiter is invoked, because Ransom says, "By Jove, I'm glad to see you." So we know that the king of the planets is at work at the moment.
Well, and one of the things to keep in mind about that is the first time we hear "by Jove," the next time we hear "by Jove," I believe, I don't think it appears in Great Divorce, is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And Peter swears "by Jove" in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And we know that in 1939, so just a couple of years earlier, Lewis had already begun writing at least the first draft of, the first paragraph of what would become the Narnia books. And so the idea that he's thinking about the astrological and the astronomical is certainly bubbling. Michael Ward discovers the astronomical in the Narnia books and then finds it backwards. But of course, Lewis develops it forwards. And so he's laying the seeds for his thoughts about the planets that we'll see in his next fiction.
And Jupiter is actually going to be mentioned again this chapter. But before we get there, Ransom apologizes for not meeting Lewis at the station. And he asks an illuminating question, whether he got through the barrage without any damage. What was he talking about?
I'll say I guess the short answer is a spiritual battle. And as we're going to see in this chapter between good and evil, we've learned before that Malacandra has been sort of barricaded off the Silent Planet, and now there is a siege going on. And so kind of in the same way we saw forces acting against Ransom in the first book, so he's got perfect experience with this. He knew this was going to happen here. And so Lewis experiences this. And this kind of connects to something I said earlier of just how there is already right from the beginning this understanding that there is a real, tangible, material battle going on of good and evil, and that is being really effectively communicated through here. But I love, and I want to bring highlight to this right after that, I loved the sentence, "I was pretty sure you'd get through somehow." So it's like there's a recognition that there's a battle happening, but there's also a trust that even though it won't be easy, even though it won't be emotionally, physically, spiritually painful, that God's will be done if we continue to remain obedience. And so I really appreciated that.
Yeah, and Lewis is quite shocked to find out that our own Adilla, the fallen angels, they've been mounting some kind of psychological attack on him, and it wasn't just simply his nerves.
And remember that Lewis is also writing the Screwtape Letters right around this time.
I will say too, I'm curious your guys' thoughts on this, but I personally can be pretty harsh on myself of like, let's say I'm feeling a fear or an anxiety or a worry of some sort. maybe it's not like a weakness. It's just a psychological attack from Satan. The grace that God's given me is not a lifting of that, but just the ability to handle it, to sit in it, and to continue to act accordingly to his will, even if I still have that psychological attack. My personal brain is like, no, that's a weakness. You got to get rid of that. And you just can't have that. And so I find this interesting. I'm wondering if you guys think that's a correct statement. I'm not sure if Lewis is trying to communicate that or this is just more of a side thing.
Well, in 2 Corinthians, Jesus tells Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul had asked for whatever this thorn in the flesh was to be removed several times. So I think if it's good enough for St. Paul, it's probably good enough for us. And actually, as you were talking about that, what came to mind was I think it was Lutheran satire. They got pictures of the apostles being martyred, great paintings, and they put moving mouths on them and had them spouting some of the things from Joel Osteen's "Your Best Life Now." So my context for this is always the apostles and martyrs, and it's just like that's a pattern to follow, as Paul himself exhorts us to.
Well, and some of it too, I think, is Lewis. I mean, he's very modernist in this novel, and he's very much arguing about modernism and trying to suggest a different way. One of the things that's all the rage right now is that every bad emotion can be explained by psychology. And if you have proper analysis, you don't have to feel that way. Guilt, Freud says, is just neurosis. Now, I think that fundamentalists go far too far, and I consider myself a small f fundamentalist. I believe in all the fundamentals of theology.
Mostly the fun.
Mostly the fun, yes. I'm trying to put the fun back into fundamentalism. The idea that it's only nerves certainly isn't true. There is always a spiritual component to what we physically go through. The idea that it is only a demon, right? I cast out the spirit of nervousness. I don't know where in the Bible there's a spirit of nervousness or whatever. I think oftentimes what you see sometimes in the fundamentalist or evangelical, charismatic churches is they have a spirit for everything, right? A spirit of debt or a spirit of poverty. And I don't know that that's the case. And we tend to either under-spiritualize or over-spiritualize. And part of what Lewis is doing in these novels is integrating the physical and the spiritual. And as we see at the end, in the interactions between Weston and Ransom, you absolutely see this integration of the physical and the spiritual.
Well, moving on, our narrator, Lewis, he begins to tell Ransom some of the worrying things that he'd been thinking during the attack. And Ransom's response is rather wonderful. He says, they'll put all sorts of things into your head if you let them. The best plan is take no notice and keep straight on. Don't try to answer them. They like drawing you into an interminable argument. I wanted to see what you guys thought of this advice.
Oh, I think it's fantastic. It's incredibly applicable. It can be easy to... I've always believed that Satan puts a ton of negative beliefs into our mind. And if they're more minor ones and just little ones, I think, you just completely ignore it. If they happen to be stronger and deeper, I've always believed in just naming it, binding it up, and then in the name of Jesus Christ, casting it out. Just if you can take no notice and move straight on, that's like the best thing.
Well, and I've been struck by this for years. This was underlined in my book. I think that that's great advice for almost everything.
Not marriage, though.
No. No. But sometimes in marriage, right? When you live with somebody, they are going to annoy you, right? Or when Matt lives with somebody, he is going to annoy her.
Hey, no blasphemy here. No blasphemy. We keep this all in line with the magisterium.
Sure, but you keep talking about how she's so near a saint, and we all know where you stand on it.
Now that's the truth. I agree with that statement. Now we're back in line.
And so, one of the bits of marriage advice is a bit of recovery advice or a bit of navigating life. Does it need to be said? Does it need to be said by me? Does it need to be said by me right now? And usually one of those answers is no. One of the things that you learn in any close relationship, especially when you share a space with somebody, is I'm going to be irritating. She is going to be irritating. Most of the daily grace comes from taking no notice and keeping straight on. Don't try to answer every little quibble. Now, I need to kind of ask the question, how important is it? But this advice, somebody else is trying to pull me astray from what I'm doing. It's a great bit of advice for prayer. the best idea is to take no notice and to keep straight on. I think that's, I could get a tattoo of that.
The only thing I wanted to mention in regards to this is the advice is a little different from what Screwtape says, where he says, "It is funny how mortals always picture us putting things into their minds. In reality, our best work is done by keeping things out."
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Ransom, then, he expresses some doubts over the existence of this, he calls him the Dark Lord. I love how he describes the enemy in this, the Dark Lord, the depraved Oyasa of Tellus. If anyone wants to renew liturgical books, I am totally fine with that being inserted in the exorcisms of baptism. But Andrew, as our resident Latin scholar, what does he mean, the Oyasa of Tellus?
Tellus is the word. Tellurian is another adjective for it. It's a Latin-based word meaning referring to the earth. Mm. And so you find that not only in Lewis, but in a lot of science fiction and fantasy novels. Sol, S-O-L, is the sun. And so like in The Martian, Matt Damon counts things in how many sols, which is S-O-L-S, which is how many Earth revolutions around the sun. And so, Tellus is just Tellurian of to or related to the earth.
I did find it interesting that this Dark Lord is referred to as the Oyasa of Tellus, almost like Tellus has a root back to a pre-fall, pre-Thulcandrian name for our planet. Although, since it is Latin, it's currently Latin, but maybe that is a word that has been preserved.
Ooh. Watch this. At the risk of analogically analyzing, at the risk of over-spiritualizing, part of what the whole Earth, the silent planet, even the silence of the planet, is meant to tell us about Maladil, blessed be he. A stretch? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that even the silence can be eloquent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Lewis is telling us a story, and in his story, Ransom is telling us a story. And so you've got all this story framework. And so in some ways, and part of what happens on Earth is we make stories. Tolkien certainly would agree. So I think it's a convenient pun, even if not intentional.
Well, how does Ransom address Lewis's doubts, and how does Ransom actually respond to that?
Go ahead, Matt, because you're wrong.
This is what comes from putting down notes. We get to see what the other's about to think.
Yeah. Well, it seemed like, maybe I'm answering this in a little bit different order, but it seemed like Lewis, so he has these doubts, and he's essentially, Ransom has asked him, are these real? And then Lewis says no, but he said he felt shame. And I just really interpreted it as when you're embarrassed about something, did you really mean that? No, of course not. Of course not. But even deep down, you're kind of like, well, yeah. And then Ransom just kind of responds, well, great, perfect. I'll explain things later.
Yeah, I go another way. Ransom fixed me suddenly with one of his mild but strangely formidable glances. You are in real doubt about either, are you? Mm-hmm. Meaning, are you quite certain this Dark Lord really exists? And if there are two sides, which side is ours? By the way, that two sides question comes back up with Edmund when he says, how can we tell which side the beaver is on? Mm-hmm. Right? Or the robin, right? And this idea of sides is a nasty idea made up of doubt. And so then the whole book just really reeks of being Inklings. And you can hear almost Inklings meetings because, as we later find in the chapter, another Inkling is brought up. We wonder if maybe fictional Ransom attended a meeting of the Inklings. I think he would certainly have been welcome. And the kind of interplay and interaction and going after each other, as Tolkien said, hammer and tongs, that's part of what happened at the Inklings meetings. So Ransom says, does this Dark Oyarsis exist, and which side is he on? And then Lewis says that, and Ransom looks at him and he says, are you really in doubt about either? And he's like, crap, no. And I felt ashamed. He did feel ashamed because he got called out on kind of blurting out something that he really didn't believe, and blurting out something that came from doubt rather than from faith. And I think that the Inklings probably called each other out all the time. And I think that's part of why Lewis loved the Inklings, is because they could be criticized, and they could criticize each other and really challenge each other to say what is really true. And so I think that's some of what's happening here. I think that he did feel ashamed, and he loves being caught out, and he loves being corrected because he's hungry for the truth.
Yeah, I read this as just him expressing the things that he had thought while he was under attack. And Ransom saying, really? And he goes, well, actually, no. It was still like the afterglow of that attack was still making him doubt all the things that by this point he shouldn't be doubting. And so Ransom's like, all right, let's go get some food.
Yeah. Which will probably help.
Always. That's the thing we learned in Out of the Silent Planet. It's like you can't be tired, you can't be hungry. Bad things happen in those times.
Yeah, I think I was. The more you say that, I'm more in your camp. I'm still like a little 50-50, just because that one sentence, I'll explain as we go along. It's like, well, if he knows and that statement's correct, then why does he need to explain something? That's the part that's still a little unknown to me, but it's not a super critical point.
I think that's the spiritual life again and again. Paul says in Philippians, it doesn't hurt me to tell you again, but it's good for you to hear this again, because we often need to be reminded of our core truths. Lewis says this in Mere Christianity, that part of the Christian life is bringing Christian truths to the mind to have them reinforced and strengthened.
Yeah.
We're foolish creatures that let our emotions get the best of us quite often. Well, Lewis then asks about the coffin, and Ransom says that he's going to travel in it. Lewis assumes that the Eldil is going to be taking him back to Malacandra. What's Ransom's reaction? Because this was one of my favorite parts of this chapter.
Yeah, you know what I thought was really interesting was when he describes his wish to go to Malacandra. I thought it was interesting how he does a complete 180, first of all. And he was just like, oh man, I would have loved to gone back to Malacandra. And I thought what was really interesting about that is there's just such a wisdom in that statement as well. I mean, go back to our time and Out of the Silent Planet, go back and think through his fears that entire journey. Maybe it wasn't quite as extreme as the psychological thriller the last chapter was in this book, but I mean, it was definitely a slow progression of constantly being forced to go into the unknown and being afraid of it. And ultimately, he finds out, had he just had the right understanding and disposition of what this was, it was the most beautiful journey of his life. And I think with the spiritual journey, we have something very similar. I mean, how often are we afraid to walk out into the unknown, to take that next leap? All the anxiety that can happen as we're wrestling with it. We feel like this is God's will. We do it. And then we come through it and we're like, oh man, that was just so incredibly beautiful. I'm so grateful.
You also have a constant theme in Lewis here of remembered beauty. And so that's the definition of Sehnsucht, or joy, or longing. It begins with the biscuit tin and the garden in the old house. It is a beauty remembered that stabs with longing to get back there. And he can't even bear to have Lewis mention to Ransom this place that he longs to go back to. And he rhapsodizes about that. And that's a theme that Lewis is writing about all his life. He writes about it literally from the time he's a teenager until the very end. And so
Andrew,
this is a prime example of that.
It's the arc of a pleasure fully experienced.
A pleasure is full grown only when it is remembered. That's what we learned in Out of the Silent Planet.
Yes.
Yes, it is. But even the sharpening of the pleasure is the longing for it. Grief is a form of joy, right? Some people call grief a love with no place to go. And the nostalgia of looking back and the anticipation of looking forward, right? Right now, Matt, you're only in the looking forward, but in 7 or 8 or 10 years, you'll look back on those weeks running up to your wedding and the actual wedding, and you'll giggle about that. And what's happening with the wedding, the actual day will be, frankly, a bit of a blur, but the looking forward to it, especially together, and the looking back on it, especially together. And then when in subsequent years, when you get together with various friends and we bring up this about the wedding or that about the wedding, and remember when Uncle so-and-so slipped on the cake and everybody started laughing, whatever, So the looking forward and the looking back add to the very moment. And that whole of that experience is what Lewis calls joy. And he's experienced some of that right now when he thinks about Malacandra.
And this is the passage where he mentions Jupiter again.
Yes.
He talks about Jupiter rising. And throughout this section, there's actually echoes to the postscript of Out of the Silent Planet, because he talks about the smells. In Out of the Silent Planet, he says, "Oh, how can I get across the Malacandrian smells? Nothing comes back to me more vividly in my dreams, especially the early morning smell in those purple woods." And also about Jupiter rising. It's not quite so explicit. You can derive the meaning from the text, but at the postscript of Out of the Silent Planet, he says, "Imagine the Milky Way magnified, the Milky Way seen through our largest telescope on the clearest night. It's too bright to look at it for long, but it is only a preparation. Something else is coming. Now the true king of night is up, and now he is threading his way through the strange western galaxy and making its lights dim by comparison with his own."
Yeah.
It's just, this is a preparation for what we're really going to get in Perelandra. Lewis's prose at its best.
It really, it's glowing prose.
Well, Ransom explains that he's being sent to Perelandra, what we call Venus. Why does he think he's being sent? We addressed this at least a little bit in the opening quotation, but why does he think he's going there?
He mentions, and I might be jumping ahead a few paragraphs and stuff, but they recognize the isolation of the world is coming to an end, potentially. I guess the Oyarsa had mentioned that could be an offshoot here. So that obviously suggests that there is a battle going on. And so this battle is heating up. He has no idea what he's going for, but there is some sort of thing due to the changing of the structure that's happening right now, a new phase in the spiritual battle of the planets and all of that stuff is starting to play out. And he knows he's going to be a tool and instrument of the Almighty God, but he doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah, and this actually answers my question from last week when I said, wait, wasn't there a siege happening? Well, it seems that something there is changing. Ransom also says that both sides are being less covert. I'm not entirely sure what that might mean. It's clearly manifesting in some way. It might be the world context of World War II. You know, the face of evil is revealing itself a little bit more obviously.
It is without a doubt World War II, because shortly after he says, "You and I could contribute no more to it than a flea could contribute to the defense of Moscow." And the Nazi siege on Moscow is between September 31st, 1941 and January 7th, 1942. And so the siege of Moscow is taking place right as Lewis is writing this. So World War II is really crucial for Lewis. And he's seeing, in some ways, I think he hoped, and the hopes weren't satisfied, that modernism, the rejection of God, all of that stuff that's happening, the Christian ideal, left untried, psychology, evolution, all of that stuff is crowding in. The defeat of languages and story are no longer respected or trusted. And then you've got this Second World War. And I think that between this and that hideous strength, you see this kind of, Lewis is looking at the war in terms of spiritual possibilities and solar possibilities. And so I think he's thinking that this new movement that we'll see in that hideous strength, this new movement is using the war to start to break out and to push back against the dark archon of Malacandra. And I think that Lewis and the Inklings probably wondered, hey, I wonder if this is something new spiritually that's happening. You see Lewis saying in Mere Christianity right around this same time that the final stage of evolution has come, and it is the incarnation. And so it has to be different categorically what happens next. And so I think that there's something really apocalyptic about the sense and the hope that the spiritual warfare in the coming kingdom were kind of on the cusp. Not Jesus is coming back tomorrow, not left behind necessarily, but this idea that humans could take advantage of what was a set aside spirituality. I think that that's really filling a lot of the writings that Lewis does at this time.
And they've also got word that Satan, and here he refers to him as the Black Archon, which I do think is probably the coolest name. But that Satan is going to attack Perelandra. He can't leave Earth himself. He can't get beyond the moon because he'd just be driven back. So this attack is going to happen in some other way. And then that then leads to the question, well, what has Ransom actually got to do with this attack on Perelandra?
I kind of mentioned this a little bit in the previous one, but he doesn't fully know. And he's speculating. And so I think what I liked more about this was, one, he has a complete trust. He just knows he'll be used in some way. And two, he knows it's not for anything particularly special. I thought it was a really beautiful message. Even had this exposition. I can't remember if it was this exact section or if it was a few paragraphs before or after, but how, maybe it's due to the fact that he knows the language. He only knows that because he was forced into a role by nothing outside of himself, because some people abducted him kind of unexpectedly, coincidentally, because of where he was, wrong time, wrong place, brought up to be sacrificed. By happenstance, he learns this. So it's just another beautiful example of the spiritual journey, that sometimes the gifts that we have that end up being the reason we're called to something were provided to us by nothing to do on our own, but by the grace of God. And it's all for the sake that we can't be vain. So I don't know if I just combined 5 questions in one, but
I think the spiritual aspect of this is St. Paul reminds us that this light and momentary affliction is working for us a weight of glory that far, outweighs. And the things of this life, and Lewis right around this same time, I hate to say it, is writing The Weight of Glory, where he talks about how we are eternal and things are temporal. And so he's casting this in the perspective of, and he was not kidnapped accidentally. All of this is by design, and all of this is Satan trying to frustrate him, but the Lord redeeming even what the devil does.
Oh, that's a good word.
Shall but prove mine instrument, as it says in the Silmarillion.
Absolutely. And you also see Lewis casting almost all spiritual conflict in terms of war. And that's, I think, left over from his participation in the First War.
I mean, there's military language in the section. He talks about being ordered there, like he's a soldier.
Yes.
And there's
exactly.
and like in the army, there's a chain of command. He doesn't have this command. It's not coming ultimately from the Oyasa, but further up and further in. We're going to
yes, indeed,
because Lewis is a good medievalist, among other things. This next section made me chuckle because it's rather funny, because Lewis tries to object to this Perelandrian plan, and Ransom admits that the whole thing, it's a little absurd. What does he think's absurd about it?
He doesn't like the idea that it's a physical contest.
Well, I would say it's even before that. It's having this mild-mannered philologist setting out to battle single-handedly powers and principalities on distant planets.
Right. And read that verse that you have.
Yeah, this verse from Ephesians, it's at the back of all of this chapter. For our struggle is not against the enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Ransom responds against this absurdity that this philologist is going to battle demonic forces. He makes the point that the Bible talks about very ordinary people doing this every day.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where he quibbles over the translation of Ephesians. It's instead suggesting hypersomatic beings at great heights.
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah, I was going to say. But Lewis reduces this just to a moral conflict. And Ransom laughs, but Lewis insists that there's a difference. And Ransom agrees there is a difference, but he still thinks it's megalomania to think that any of us have a place in this fight at all in any sense. But he then goes on to suggest that the phase of the battle may be changing, so therefore the mode of battle in which the dark forces are fought might also be changing too.
Well, I got to say, this is so biblical. I mean, this is one of the most beautiful parts about The Chosen, is because it so beautifully represents the ordinariness of the disciples, and yet they were chosen and called. I mean, this is the gospel message. Christ uses the most ordinary of individuals, not the most intelligent, not the highest powered, not the wealthiest. I mean, that was almost none of those characteristics could be used to describe the disciples. Maybe Matthew got some wealth. So anyways, I just think this is, again, beautiful. This continues to just be all a part of like the spiritual journey. Lewis worked this in so beautifully.
Well, and it's not megalomania. Lewis says in Weight of Glory, again, at the same time, our desires are not too strong, but too weak, right? We don't realize that we are spiritual people in God's army who have the responsibility to do spiritual warfare, and Ransom is not thinking highly enough of himself And I think that the definition of humility is not thinking terribly about yourself, is thinking the same thing about yourself that God thinks of you. And like Lewis says in Mere Christianity, if God thought that it was worth it to send his son to save this fallen world, well, it must be worth it. If he thinks of us highly enough to say that we're part of the spiritual battle, it must be true. He must be right.
Mm.
One note about the changing in the mode of battle. Ransom seems to suggest that the current mode has been in place since the angelic fall. That would actually mean for the entirety of human history. So I'm not quite sure about that because, you see more overt battles throughout biblical history. But that's by the by. As we heard in the opening quotation, Ransom seems to think that he's been selected for the job not for any particular excellence, but as I suggested in my 100-word summary, for his linguistic skills, which he picked up on Malacandra after being kidnapped and taken there in Out of the Silent Planet. Matt, what is the implication that if he knows the language on Malacandra, why is he then selected to go to Perelandra? What's the implication?
Same language.
Yeah, because apparently 2 or 3 months ago, Ransom discovered that Hlab, which should be called Old Solar, Hlab Erebol F Cordi, literally the tongue of the field of Arbol. So he discovered that this was once throughout the solar system. And it's rather cute. Ransom's actually a little bit disappointed that he's going to Perelandra and isn't going to actually have to learn a new language. The philological instinct dies hard on this one.
Yeah.
One interesting consequence to this. Do you remember back in Out of the Silent Planet, the Hrossa word for to eat? It contains consonants unreproducible by the human mouth. That's what the text says.
Mm.
Putting my philologist hat on, that means that word probably wasn't Old Solar. It's probably a newer word that was introduced by the Hrossa, since Old Solar would need to be spoken by everybody, including those on Salcandra.
Ah. Maybe it was unpronounceable because they made it up while their mouths were full.
Maybe they were eating. Yes, exactly. And Ransom says that Sunuba, which is the language of the Sorns, as well as the language of the Fifiltriki, because those were the other two languages on Malacandra, that those are much more modern. He says that it's no earlier than the Cambrian period, which is about 500 million years ago. So
yes, and lasted for about 35 million years.
Yes. It's ancient, just less ancient. And
yes,
just as a side, I went to Minneapolis to go to the Byzantine liturgy this weekend. In the Byzantine calendar, it was the feast of the fathers of the first 6 ecumenical councils. So it's just the first few hundred years of the church. And there was a group of Dominicans that were visiting the liturgy that day. And so our pastor kept referring to them as a new order, since, Dominicans are like 11th century. It's like, oh, the new kids on the block. It's the same sort of thing. It's like they're ancient, just less ancient.
Yeah. Yeah, Lewis's rooms were in the new buildings, which were, built before our country was born.
Hmm. Lewis asks Ransom what he's expecting to find on Perelandra. What does he say?
No idea. No, seriously, that's the answer. No, I'm kidding. Actually, it is. That kind of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, just that complete trust. He's not entirely sure. He's just, but notice, I do want to say this, and I think this is a really important distinction between the last book and this book. The last book, he came in with all of the reading all the wrong materials, that theme that Lewis has discussed before. It led to fears, misconceptions, aliens, foreign, all of that stuff. This time he's going in with a similar set of no knowledge, except he's got one very distinct piece of knowledge. And that is that there's an Oyarsa and a good God that's kind of driving all of this, and he's an instrument in his hands. Yep. And so there's just a complete different disposition to really the same unknown conditions, like practically identical.
Well, he says that for some jobs, it's best not to know too much in advance. And I was trying to think, yeah, that's true. And I thought, wait, what sort of jobs is it best not to know too much in advance? And the only one that sprang to mind was parenthood. It's like, you don't need to know too much. No, just you'll find out.
Well, and what he has learned is not only Old Solar, but he's learned trust. He's learned trust in things that he cannot see. He's learned that the spiritual hierarchy, literally the hierarchy of spirits, right, is real and reliable. And so he goes to Perelandra trusting and not in terror, right? And he knows that he will have all he needs when he gets to where he's supposed to be. And that's actually a really, really good lesson, I think.
And regarding the conditions, he knows that it'll be warm, which is why he's going naked. Yeah, he is naked and unashamed.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the reasons why this book would be difficult to turn into a movie. And also why it's difficult to stage the opera with too much setting. He also says that astronomers actually don't know too much about Venus, given its thick atmosphere. Obviously, we know much more now.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, there was apparently an open question as to whether it revolved on its own axis and at what speed. And he cites Giovanni
Schiaparelli.
Thank you.
Schiaparelli.
And he was actually a real astronomer. I looked him up. He thought it took a trip around the sun to rotate on its axis, which would mean that as Venus is going around the sun, always the same side is facing the sun, and the other side will always be away from it.
Yeah. And Michael Ward mentions Schiaparelli in his Planet Narnia. The thing that I loved was as you walk towards the dark side, it becomes more and more twilight. And as presumably as you in the dark side, you walk towards the light, it becomes more and more like the morning. And you guys missed the trick. It's a reference, or at least a hint, an echo of Lewis's second best book, where it's either the twilight becoming night or the twilight becoming morning in The Great Divorce. So just let me take a swig there.
He actually said one thing that confused me about that. When he said, you'd come to the country of eternal twilight, getting colder and darker every mile you went, and presently you wouldn't be able to go further because there'd be no more air.
Mm-hmm.
Surely the atmosphere is keeping in air? I'm not sure why darkness would necessitate no air. But the text speaks of Ransom's eyes sparkling here, and it's suggesting that he's actually looking forward to the adventure. And it even says that Lewis himself feels a vicarious thrill. That is at least until Ransom says something else, namely that Lewis has a role to play in the adventure, and suddenly he feels a thrill of a very different kind.
Yes.
So what's Jack's job going to be?
So he's supposed to wait until Ransom comes back and await a signal from Oyarsa and then come and help Ransom. And he's not sure if that's going to be 6 months or 20 years. And then his job is also to, if he gets too old, then to find somebody else to take over that he can trust, and also to bring a doctor.
I love the fact that he might have to find somebody to take up the job after him. So this book basically has apostolic succession in it. Loved that.
Yes.
What I also appreciated too, how he says, when you wait, it'll become known from the Oyarsa, will prompt him. Just how confident he was in that.
Particularly since they don't speak the same language.
Yes. It's like if you have the ears to listen and the eyes to receive, or whatever you want to say, and you truly, God will communicate to you.
Yes. Ears to hear and eyes to see.
That's the one.
And apparently Ransom isn't going to need air, food, or water while he's in this coffin, because he's going to be in a form of suspended animation. And whereas in Malacandra, the spaceship moved by the lesser properties of light, in this case, he's going to be powered by the Oyarsa of Malacandra himself, who's going to take the coffin.
Mm-hmm.
Although for some reason, again, in the text it was talking about they had to position the coffin correctly to avoid trees and buildings. I don't know why that would be difficult for an Oyarsa, but...
Yeah. Well, and he's just making it up. He's not interested in the mechanics of space travel. He's interested in the spiritual ramifications of it.
Just another reason why I should have been an inkling and got to critique these books before they got published. I did love how Lewis asks Ransom how he's feeling about this. And Ransom actually gives an example that Lewis himself gives in Mere Christianity about faith. That you can believe in anesthetic, but you can still panic when the mask is put over your face. He thinks this kind of confronting and the testing of your faith is probably, he calls it good practice.
Well, and a better C.S. Lewis scholar on the podcast would have looked up when around this time Lewis had to go under anesthetic for some kind of procedure. But, sorry, you're stuck with what you got.
Andrew, you mentioned that Ransom should bring a doctor. Who specifically does he bring?
Robert E. Havard. They nicknamed him Humphrey. He was a doctor who was in the Inklings. They also called him the UQ, the useless quack. He wrote an epilogue in Problem of Pain about animal pain. And so he was the resident medical person. And the fact that Ransom is familiar with Humphrey Havard and knows his quality indicates to me that fictional Ransom probably accompanied fictional Lewis to a fictional meeting of the Inklings where he saw the fictional Humphrey, who is in fact a real person. I know that's what Matt was going to say. Sorry to steal your thunder, buddy.
I appreciate this. I always want to just let you feel a part of the conversation, Andrew.
Thanks. You're a giver.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I hadn't realized until I came to this chapter that Humphrey was actually a nickname, that it wasn't his given name.
Oh,
in the
really?
Same way, yeah. In the same way Jack wasn't C.S. Lewis's given name either. I tried to find out where it came from. The best I can find is that it came from Hugo Dyson, but people don't know why. I reached out to Sarah Odell, who's writing a book on Humphrey Havard. I haven't heard back from her yet, but if she's got any secret information as to where this came from, I'll let people know in a future episode.
Yeah.
But Ransom covers a few more practical matters before setting off. Ransom says that he's left Lewis out of his will, and I was actually a little surprised that they were that close. You know, they'd seemed to be on mission clearly, but to actually write somebody who's not family into a will is a pretty significant thing. But why has Ransom taken Lewis out of his will? This is kind of dark.
It's due to the fact that if he comes back or doesn't come back or he's dead, that he doesn't assume that there was any sort of nefarious behavior on Lewis's part. But I think what's more beautiful here is, and I didn't think about this when I was reading it, the disposition of Ransom going into this is I might die. Mm-hmm. And you see no fear. I mean, that was one of the biggest takeaways from Out of the Silent Planet was having a wisdom of death. And he's got a wisdom of death. It changed him.
I loved the sentence, "We laid our heads together, and for a long time we talked about those matters which one usually discusses with relatives and not with friends." And we know that a year before writing this book, Lewis has written to Warney a letter that talks about the four loves and names all four. So the Philia friends, the friends Ransom and Lewis, put their heads together and talk about matters of intimate storge as if they're family. And then another thing we find in that paragraph, Lewis says, "I hadn't known the extent of Ransom's charities." I don't remember exactly when Barfield takes over the money. In fact, it must be after this. So Lewis must have been charitable already, but Screwtape comes out. Lewis gives away all that money and, of course, doesn't have any left to pay the taxes. And so I think it's a couple of years after the writing of this paragraph that Barfield takes over Lewis's finances and funnels off 2/3 of the royalty income to charitable causes. And so I think that he's inspired by Ransom here to be the same sort of charitable person himself. And I imagine he's already giving away a lot of his money.
Yeah, the timeline on that one in particular is quite impressive, that he's writing about himself in the future.
Yes, absolutely.
And before we leave, as they're feeling the impending departure, I love the phrase graveyard gloom. It's got that Anglo-Saxon alliteration.
Yes, which is later picked up in Lewis's best book about gloom.
When Ransom says that they should prepare for his departure, Lewis assumes he's not leaving until the Oyasa returns. But he then discovers that he never left, and that time apparently works very differently for the Oyasa. They don't wait, per se. But they then see the Oyasa back in the other room. Lewis is sworn in to the mission, and they take the coffin outside, and a naked, blindfolded Ransom gets in the coffin, and it flies away. Anything you want to say about Ransom's departure from Earth?
It seems almost as sudden as the ascension. I mean, it's like bang, and he's gone.
Like the fact that Lewis then goes in and vomits.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we have a time jump. After an apparently dark year or so, the Oyasa appears to Lewis, and he takes that as a signal to return to the cottage with Humphrey the doctor. When the coffin returns, why does Lewis initially cry, "Good God, all smashed to bits"?
Well, so he sees his red stuff. We kind of learn as it's playing out, you're just like, oh my goodness, he's dead. He's just got completely eviscerated effectively. And you've got like dust, except it's more like dried red blood stuff. We find out that it wasn't that. We find out it was flowers, which was interesting.
And it ties in with Out of the Silent Planet's ideas of perception. He initially sees, but he sees incorrectly.
Right.
And actually, one of the things that they discover when they pop open the coffin lid, that although it's not blood, it's red flowers, Ransom does have a cut on his foot, though. And I will refer us back to the dream that Ransom had after he was drugged in Out of the Silent Planet, where his legs started hurting. In the story, it's because, he's been drugged and fallen asleep with his legs crossed. But here, could this have been foreshadowing? We're not sure. How does Ransom respond to being awoken from the grave, so to speak?
It's funny at first, but I think there's a profound wisdom too below the surface here. So there's a bit of just classical humor where it shocks you because he's more concerned about them. This guy was just on this entire mission and going to another planet and all this other stuff. And he comes back and he thinks they look bad and is more concerned with them.
Yeah, Ransom looks in great shape. The text says, I was silent for a moment, astonished at the form which had risen from that narrow house. Almost a new Ransom, glowing with health and rounded with muscle and seemingly 10 years younger. In the old days, he'd been beginning to show a few grey hairs, but now the beard which swept his chest was pure gold. And Ransom is cold. Remember that it's cold in comparison to Venus. And so he asked for some hot water and some clothes. And fortunately, Humphrey thought of that. Lewis didn't. And interestingly, he doesn't want bacon or eggs, but he wants fruit, bread, or he eventually settles on porridge.
He's a vegan.
Well, this was it. I was going to ask, why do you think there is a sort of, it depends on how one views pre-fallen man and whether or not he could have been a carnivore.
Interesting.
But there is a more earthy dynamic to the foods that he's asking for: fruit, bread, porridge.
Well, the pre-fallen man idea is really important because, as we'll find out, Ransom eats fruit on Perelandra. Doesn't eat any flesh. And so I think that that's good. So he's eating natural things that have been grown. Let's not run across the hot water and the clothes because it reminds me of the scene where they leave Hobbiton and they come to, where do they come to? Bilbo's new house. They've gone before and made baths for them already with the baths to have them. And water hot is a noble thing and they splash around. And then perhaps the two were written around the same time. But what do you think? What about the kind of vegetarian course food that he's given?
Got nothing.
What about you, David?
I think it's certainly symbolic of a more harmonious, peaceful existence. It's all very earthy, fruit from the trees, bread and oats from the ground.
Porridge, good, solid Scottish horse food.
Exactly. Well, as they sit down to tea and beer and cold meats, Ransom begins to tell his story. So is there anything you guys like to share before we wrap up?
No, now I want some beer and cold meats.
Mm-hmm.
I might make myself some porridge. It's still early.
No, I got nothing.
Yeah, well, I think that we've filled out more than enough for this episode, but it's just so delightful. And the conceit, meaning the conception of it is so good. And as you pointed out, David, the prose is really, that's part of why I think this is one of Lewis's favorites and one of people's favorite books. Incidentally, having done Screwtape Letters and then Mere Christianity, my class at churchofthemessiah.com, the Diving Deeper class that is broadcast live every week on YouTube from 5 to 6 Eastern time, no plug there, is The Great Divorce. And my class size has almost doubled or tripled.
See, the people know. The people know.
Well, no, they don't. It's because I haven't offered till we have faces yet. But I think that what they love is a story. And remember what Tolkien said about Lewis. Lewis pressed Tolkien to take his histories and his languages and his maps and all the rest. And Tolkien said to Walter Hooper, Jackie had to have a story. And the importance of story, especially in an age in the 40s where story narrative is in disfavor. It's in bad repute. Modernists don't care about a narrative. They care about the ridiculous. And so for Lewis to write such a good story and to write it so well. And I think that part of the language being so good attests to the fact that he's probably reading it to the Inklings and they're quibbling on some of the words. And so I'm grateful to be reading a story and reading such a good one.
Well, I hear the final call for final drinks. So thanks to our intern, Julia, and our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah, and our Patreon supporters, particularly our top tier ones, which hopefully is expanding. Rebecca, Becca, Kevin, Mary Margaret, Aldo, Alex, James, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Bud1, Bud2, Shane, K, Paul, Gary, Stephen, Kelly, Chris, John, James, Kate, Peter, David, Angela, and Rowdy. And of course, to all of our listeners.
Please join us again next time,
when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.